I never thought my own mother would sit in a courtroom and swear under oath that I was somewhere I'd never been. But there she sat in the witness box, her voice steady as granite as she lied to protect my stepfather. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look like a stranger wearing my mother's clothes. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if the story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Miss Patterson, can you tell the court where your daughter was on the evening of March 15th? The defense attorney's voice carried across the silent courtroom like a blade. Mom's hands folded precisely in her lap, the same way she'd taught me to sit during church services when I was 8 years old. Cassandra was at home with us that entire evening. She never left the house. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table until my knuckles went white, watching this woman who had raised me, who had bandaged my scraped knees and celebrated my college graduation, commit perjury to save the man who had destroyed my life. But let me back up, because the betrayal that led us to that courtroom began 6 months earlier on what should have been the happiest day of my career. I was 28 years old, finally living the life I'd always imagined. After 4 years of grinding through journalism school and another 3 years working nights at a small-town newspaper in Oregon, I'd landed my dream job as an investigative reporter for the Portland Tribune. My apartment in the Pearl District wasn't much, a cramped one-bedroom with a view of a brick wall, but it was mine, and it represented everything I'd worked for. That March morning started like any other. I was hunched over my laptop at Stumptown Coffee, nursing my third espresso and reviewing documents for a story about city council corruption, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom, which was unusual. We talked every Sunday like clockwork, but Wednesday calls were rare. Cass, honey, I need to tell you something. Her voice sounded strained, careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. What's wrong? I asked, minimizing my laptop screen to give her my full attention. It's about Richard. He's been having some legal troubles. Richard Thornton, my stepfather of 15 years. The man who'd married my mother when I was 13 and spent the next decade trying to convince everyone he was the perfect suburban dad. He sold insurance, coached Little League, and attended every PTA meeting with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. What kind of legal troubles? I asked, though something in my stomach was already twisting into knots. Mom was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said, "There has been an accusation. A girl from his work. She's Sam that he touched her inappropriately." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Around me, the coffee shop continued its normal rhythm, baristas calling out orders, laptops clicking, conversations humming, but everything felt muffled, distant. Mom, my voice came out smaller than I intended. Please tell me you don't believe him. Of course I believe him. Her response was immediate, defensive. Cass, you know Richard. You know what kind of man he is. This girl is lying, probably trying to get money from the company. But I did know what kind of man Richard was. I knew about the way his hand would linger on my shoulder when I was 14 years old. I knew about the comments he'd make about my developing body that Mom would dismiss as just teasing. I knew about the locked bathroom door that somehow never stayed locked when I was showering, and his sheepish, "Oops, sorry," that came a few seconds too late. I'd never told anyone about those incidents. What teenage girl wants to admit that her stepfather makes her uncomfortable, especially when he's otherwise the picture of respectability, when your mother is happier than she's been since your father died, and speaking up would mean destroying the only stable family you've ever known? Have you met her? The girl who's accusing him? No, and I don't want to. Cass, I need you to understand something. Richard's lawyer says this could go to trial. If it does, we're going to need character witnesses, people who can speak to Richard's integrity. My heart was pounding now, a steady drumbeat of dread. Mom, you're not asking me to... I'm asking you to tell the truth, that in all the years you've known Richard, he's been nothing but appropriate and respectful towards you. The lie she wanted me to tell sat between us like a third person in the conversation. I stared out the coffee shop window at the Portland Street scene and tried to process what my mother was really asking of me. I can't do that, I said quietly. What do you mean you can't do that? Her voice sharpened, taking on the edge it got when I disappointed her as a child.
I mean, I can't lie under oath, Mom. And I can't say Richard was always appropriate with me because that wouldn't be true. Silence stretched between us again, but this one felt different, colder. Cassandra Marie Walsh. She used my full name, the way she had when I was in trouble. Are you telling me that Richard ever did something inappropriate to you? The question I'd been avoiding for 15 years hung in the air. I could lie, make this easier for everyone, pretend that the uncomfortable moments had been figments of my imagination, or I could finally tell the truth. Yes, I whispered. The explosion came immediately. How dare you? How dare you make up lies about a man who treated you like his own daughter, who paid for your college, who walked you down the aisle at your wedding? I'm not making anything up. You ungrateful, selfish girl. After everything we've done for you, after everything Richard has provided, this is how you repay us? By stabbing him in the back when he needs his family most? My hands were shaking now. Other coffee shop patrons were starting to look in my direction, drawn by my mom's rising voice coming through the phone. Mom, please listen to me. No, you listen to me. Richard is innocent. This girl is lying, probably coached by some lawyer who smells money. And if you can't support your family when we need you, then maybe you need to think about what kind of person that makes you. She hung up. I sat in that coffee shop for another 2 hours staring at my laptop screen without seeing anything, trying to process the fact that my mother had just chosen her husband over her daughter without a moment's hesitation. The next few weeks passed in a blur of uncomfortable phone calls and tense text exchanges. Mom would call, her voice artificially bright, asking about my work and the weather as if our last conversation had never happened. When I'd try to bring up Richard's case, she'd shut down immediately. We're not discussing that, she'd say firmly. Richard's lawyer is handling everything. This will all blow over soon. But it didn't blow over. The story broke in the local paper back home in Salem. Insurance executive faces sexual harassment charges. And suddenly, our family drama became public knowledge. I found myself refreshing news websites compulsively, reading comment sections full of people debating Richard's guilt or innocence based on nothing but speculation. The girl who'd accused him was named Emma Rodriguez, 22 years old, fresh out of college, working as an administrative assistant at Richard's insurance agency. According to the news reports, she'd alleged that Richard had cornered her in the supply closet, pressed himself against her, and whispered inappropriate comments about her body. Reading her account felt like reading my own memories. The same predatory confidence, the same assumption that his word would matter more than hers, the same calculation that she'd be too scared or embarrassed to speak up. I found myself researching Emma Rodriguez online, an impulse I immediately felt guilty about. Her Facebook page showed a bright young woman with dark hair and a shy smile, posting pictures with friends, proud graduation photos, optimistic status updates about starting her career. She looked like I had at 22, hopeful, trusting, unprepared for someone like Richard. A month after Mom's initial call, she called again. This time, Richard's voice was in the background, and I could tell she was on speakerphone. Cass, we need to talk, she said without preamble. Richard's lawyer wants to meet with you. Why? Because the prosecution is trying to establish a pattern of behavior. They're looking for other women who might make similar accusations. Her voice was tight, controlled. We need you to make it clear that Richard has never been anything but appropriate with you. I already told you I can't do that. You can't or you won't. This time it was Richard's voice, smooth and reasonable in the way that had always made my skin crawl. Cass, I understand this is difficult, but surely you can see that one disgruntled employee could destroy everything I've worked for, everything your mother and I have built together. You mean like how you destroyed that girl's sense of safety at work? I never touched that girl. His voice hardened slightly. She's lying, Cass, and if you care about your mother at all, you'll help us prove it. How am I supposed to prove someone else is lying? By telling the truth about your own experience, by standing up for the mom who raised you.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. There it was again, the demand that I rewrite history, that I pretend Richard had been the loving stepfather instead of the predator who'd made my teenage years a minefield of uncomfortable encounters and boundary violations. What if I can't do that? I asked. The silence that followed was so long I thought they'd hung up. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Well, Cass, I suppose that would tell us where your loyalties lie, wouldn't it? 2 days later, I got a call from Richard's attorney, Thomas Brennan. He had the kind of smooth, expensive voice that belonged in corporate boardrooms and exclusive country clubs. Ms. Walsh, I understand your family is hoping you might serve as a character witness for Mr. Thornton. I'm not sure that's something I can do, I said carefully. May I ask why not? According to your mother, you've known Mr. Thornton for 15 years. Surely in all that time you've observed his character, his interactions with young women, his general demeanor. I was sitting in my apartment, looking out at the Portland skyline, trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without perjuring myself or destroying my relationship with my mother. Mr. Brennan, I think there might be some confusion about what I could testify to. No confusion at all. We simply need you to confirm that in your experience, Mr. Thornton has always behaved appropriately toward you and other young women in your presence. And what if that's not my experience? Another pause. When Brennan spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more careful, more calculating. Ms. Walsh, are you suggesting that Mr. Thornton behaved inappropriately toward you at some point? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that I can't testify that he was always appropriate because that wouldn't be truthful. I see. The words came out clipped, professional. Well, in that case, I should inform you that the prosecution might very well call you as a witness to establish pattern evidence. My blood went cold. What does that mean? It means, Ms. Walsh, that if you have allegations to make against my client, you may find yourself on the witness stand, whether you want to be there or not. After he hung up, I sat in my apartment as the implications sank in. I'd been trying to stay out of Richard's legal troubles to maintain some kind of neutral ground where I could avoid lying without actively participating in his prosecution, but that middle ground was disappearing. Either I would testify for Richard and perjure myself, or I would testify against him and destroy my relationship with my mother forever. That night, I called my best friend from college, Maya Chen, who was now a criminal defense attorney in Seattle. Maya, I need legal advice, and I need it to stay completely confidential. Of course, what's going on? I told her everything. The years of uncomfortable interactions with Richard, my mother's demands that I lie for him, the attorney's thinly veiled threats. Maya listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds that told me she was processing the legal implications. Cass, she said when I finished, you're in a really difficult position, but legally, you have only one choice. You cannot commit perjury to help your stepfather avoid consequences for sexual harassment. What about my relationship with my mom? That's not a legal question. But honey, a mother who asks her daughter to lie under oath to protect a man who sexually harassed her isn't really protecting her daughter's best interests. So what do? You tell the truth, whatever the cost. The subpoena arrived the next week. The subpoena felt heavier than a single sheet of paper should.
I held it in my hands outside my apartment building, reading the legal language that commanded my appearance at the Multnomah County Courthouse to testify in the case of State of Oregon versus Richard Allen Thornton. The date was circled in red, April 18th, 3 weeks away.
My hands shook as I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. This was about choosing between my conscience and my family, between protecting a victim I'd never met and preserving the only parent I had left. I called Mom that night, hoping against hope that maybe she'd understand why I couldn't lie for Richard. "You got a subpoena?" she said before I could even speak. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Richard's lawyer called us." "Mom, we need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about, Cassandra. You're going to get up on that witness stand and you're going to tell the court that Richard has been a good stepfather to you, period." "I can't do that. You know I can't do that." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When she spoke again, her voice was so cold it didn't sound like my mother at all. "Then you're no daughter of mine." The line went dead. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again with an apology, an explanation, anything that would indicate the woman who raised me was still in there somewhere. But the phone stayed silent. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Richard, questioning my own memories. Had I misinterpreted his behavior? Was I really going to destroy a man's life based on feelings and impressions from my teenage years? But then I'd remember Emma Rodriguez's young face in those news photos, and I'd know that my discomfort had been real, had been valid, had been exactly what it seemed. Work became my only refuge. I threw myself into my corruption investigation with manic intensity, staying at the office until midnight, taking on extra assignments, anything to keep my mind occupied. My editor, Janet Morrison, noticed the change immediately. "Walsh, you look like hell," she said, appearing at my desk with 2 cups of coffee. "When's the last time you went home?" "I went home," I said defensively. "I sleep there." "For how many hours?" She sat down in the chair next to my desk, her concerned expression making it clear this wasn't a casual check-in. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Janet was in her 50s, had been in journalism for 30 years, and had the kind of maternal authority that made even hardened reporters spill their secrets. Before I knew it, I was telling her everything about Richard's case, my family's demands, and the impossible choice I was facing. "Jesus, Cass," she said when I finished, "you're being asked to choose between perjury and family loyalty. That's not a choice anyone should have to make." I keep thinking maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I misunderstood what happened when I was younger. Janet leaned forward, her expression serious. "Let me ask you something. If a source came to you with a story about inappropriate behavior, and they described incidents that made them uncomfortable but not necessarily criminal, would you dismiss their concerns?" "Of course not." "Then why are you dismissing your own?" That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the prosecutor's office and asked to speak with Emily Chen, the attorney handling Richard's case. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the courthouse, away from the formal atmosphere that made everything feel more intimidating. Emily was younger than I had expected, probably early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too many cases like this one. She ordered a large coffee and sat across from me in the cramped booth, her legal pad ready. "Miss Walsh, I appreciate you reaching out. I know the situation is difficult for you. I need to understand what you're asking me to testify about." "We're not asking you to testify about anything specific. We're simply asking you to tell the truth about your experiences with Mr. Thornton." She paused, studying my face. "But I should be honest with you. If you have information that supports a pattern of inappropriate behavior, that could be very significant for our case. And if I don't testify, then we'll respect that decision. But Miss Walsh, I've read your articles. You're an investigative journalist. You understand the importance of truth, of holding powerful people accountable for their actions. I stared into my coffee cup, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded me of storm clouds. What about my family?
I can't make that choice for you, but I can tell you that Emma Rodriguez is brave as hell for coming forward, and she's going to face a defense team that will try to destroy her credibility, her character, and her reputation. Having someone corroborate a pattern of behavior could make the difference between justice and letting a predator walk free. That night, I called Maya again.
I think I'm going to testify, I told her. Are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back. I know, but Maya, what if I don't, and he gets away with it? What if there are other women, other girls like Emma, and I could have stopped it? And what if your family never forgives you? Then I guess I'll find out what my principles are actually worth. But the cost became clear sooner than I'd expected. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My phone was buzzing constantly with text messages, friend requests on social media, and emails to my work account. Somehow, word had leaked that Richard Thornton's stepdaughter was cooperating with the prosecution. The messages ranged from supportive to vicious. Strangers were calling me brave, while others accused me of being an attention-seeking liar trying to destroy an innocent man. Someone that dug up my social media profiles and was sharing them with comments about my appearance, my career, my past relationships. My editor called an emergency meeting. "Cass, we need to talk about how this affects your position here," Janet said, closing her office door behind me. "The Tribune has to maintain objectivity, especially when one of our reporters becomes part of a story." My heart sank. "Are you firing me?" "No, but we're going to have to pull you from active reporting until this case is resolved. You can use vacation time, or we can put you on unpaid leave." "Janet, I need this job. I need the routine, the distraction." "I know, and I wish I could make an exception. But if we keep you on active duty while you're testifying in a high-profile case, it compromises our credibility." Walking out of the Tribune building with a box of my personal items felt like a public execution. Colleagues who I'd considered friends avoided eye contact. The few who did speak to me offered awkward condolences, as if someone had died. In a way, someone had. The version of myself who believed that doing the right thing would be rewarded, who thought that family loyalty was unconditional, who trusted that truth would ultimately prevail, that person was gone. My phone rang as I loaded my box into my car. "Cass," it was my Aunt Linda, Mom's sister. "I heard about what's happening." "I figured you would. Your mother is beside herself. She's not eating, barely sleeping. This is tearing her apart." "It's tearing me apart too." "Then why are you doing it? Why can't you just say Richard was always appropriate with you? Even if there were some uncomfortable moments, does it really matter enough to destroy your family?" The question hung in the air like toxic smoke. Did it matter? Were a few inappropriate comments and boundary violations worth sacrificing my relationship with my mother? Worth losing my job, my reputation, my sense of belonging anywhere? "Aunt Linda," I said quietly, "what if it was your daughter? What if someone was pressuring her to lie under oath to protect a man who had made her uncomfortable for years?" "That's different." "How is it different?" She couldn't answer that question, and after a few more minutes of circular conversation, she hung up. The weeks leading up to the trial were the loneliest of my life. My savings account dwindled as I paid rent without income. My mother stopped answering my calls entirely. Old friends from home, people I'd known since high school, started treating me like I was contagious. I spent my days in coffee shops and libraries, researching legal precedents, reading about other women who'd testified in similar cases. Some of their stories ended in conviction and justice. Others ended in acquittal and social exile for the women who dared to speak up.
The night before I was scheduled to testify, I sat in my apartment, eating takeout Chinese food and staring at my phone. I'd written and deleted a dozen text messages to my mother, each one a variation of "I'm sorry" or "Please understand" or "I love you no matter what happens tomorrow." Finally, I sent the simplest message I could think of. "I wish things were different." She never responded. The morning of my testimony, I put on my most conservative outfit, a navy blue suit that made me look older, more serious, more credible. I practiced my answers in the mirror, trying to find the balance between honesty and precision, between protecting myself and protecting Emma Rodriguez.
At the courthouse, I sat on a bench outside the courtroom, watching lawyers in expensive suits stride past with briefcases and confidence. Emily Chen found me there 20 minutes before I was scheduled to testify. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting beside me. "I keep thinking about my mother, how she's going to look at me after today. And what about how you're going to look at yourself?" It was a good question. I'd spent so many years trying to be the good daughter, the one who didn't cause problems, who didn't make waves, who kept family secrets buried where they couldn't hurt anyone. But secrets had their own weight, their own toxicity. They poisoned relationships from the inside out. "Ms. Walsh?" A bailiff appeared beside us. "You're up." Walking into that courtroom felt like walking into a firing squad. Richard sat at the defense table in a perfectly tailored suit, looking every inch the respectable businessman. His attorney, the same Thomas Brennan who'd called me weeks earlier, watched me with predatory interest. And there, in the third row of the gallery, sat my mother. She was wearing the black dress she'd worn to my father's funeral, her face a mask of controlled anguish. When our eyes met, hers held no warmth, no recognition, no trace of the woman who used to braid my hair and read me bedtime stories. The bailiff's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" I placed my hand on the Bible and looked directly at my mother as I answered, "I do." The witness stand felt like an island in the middle of a hurricane. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on me as Emily Chen approached with her legal pad, her expression professional but kind. Behind her, I could see Richard leaning slightly forward, his jaw tight with controlled tension. "Ms. Walsh, can you please state your relationship to the defendant?" "Richard Thornton is my stepfather. He married my mother when I was 13 years old." "And how would you characterize your relationship with Mr. Thornton during your teenage years?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. This was it. The moment where I could still choose the easy path, could still say everything was fine, could still salvage my relationship with my mother. I looked at her one more time, searching for any sign of the woman who used to comfort me during thunderstorms. Her face was stone. "It was complicated," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There were times when his behavior made me uncomfortable." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, vague and prejudicial." "I'll allow it," Judge Martinez replied. "Please be specific, Miss Walsh." And so I was. For the next 40 minutes, I recounted incident after incident. The way Richard would comment on my developing body when I was 14, how he'd find excuses to touch my shoulders, my back, always just a little too long to be casual. The bathroom door that never seemed to stay locked when I was showering. The inappropriate jokes he'd make when Mom wasn't around. With each detail, I watched my mother's face grow paler, her expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like recognition, as if she was remembering things she'd chosen to forget, patterns she'd refused to see. When Emily finished her questions, Thomas Brennan stood up for cross-examination. He was everything I'd expected: slick, aggressive, determined to paint me as a vindictive stepdaughter with an agenda. "Miss Walsh, isn't it true that you waited 15 years to make these accusations? I wasn't making accusations. I was answering questions truthfully. Truthfully. He repeated the word with obvious skepticism. And in all those 15 years, you never once told your mother about these alleged incidents? That's correct. Why not? The question hit harder than I'd expected. Why hadn't I told her? Because I was a scared teenager who didn't want to be the reason her mother's marriage fell apart? Because I'd convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting? Because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying silent? I was afraid she wouldn't believe me, I said finally. Or perhaps there was nothing to believe, Brennan suggested. Perhaps what you're describing as inappropriate behavior was simply the normal interactions between a stepfather and stepdaughter? No, I said firmly. Normal stepfathers don't make sexual comments about their teenage stepdaughters' bodies. Normal stepfathers respect boundaries. After my testimony, I walked out of the courthouse into the harsh afternoon sunlight, feeling both hollowed out and strangely liberated. I'd done it. I'd told the truth, consequences be damned. But as I reached my car, I saw my mother standing beside it, her face streaked with tears. "How could you?" she whispered. "How could you destroy everything?" "Mom, I didn't destroy anything. I just told the truth." "Your truth," she spat. "Your version of events that happened 15 years ago when you were just a teenager who probably misunderstood everything." "I didn't misunderstand anything." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as if looking for the daughter she used to know. "You've ruined him, Cass. You've ruined us. I hope you're happy." She walked away without another word, leaving me alone in the courthouse parking lot, with the weight of my choices settling around me like lead. The verdict came 3 days later. Guilty on all charges. Richard was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a lifetime registration as a sex offender. Emma Rodriguez had won her case, but the victory felt Pyrrhic. My family was destroyed, my career was in shambles, and I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. That's when I made my second life-changing decision. If I was going to be unemployed and estranged from my family anyway, I might as well do something meaningful with my exile. I started reaching out to other women who'd testified in similar cases, collecting their stories, documenting the patterns of how institutions protected predators and punished victims. What began as a personal coping mechanism evolved into something bigger. I spent my savings on a freelance investigative piece about sexual harassment in Oregon's insurance industry. The research revealed a network of companies that routinely shuffled problematic employees between offices rather than firing them, creating a traveling roadshow of workplace predators. The Portland Tribune wouldn't touch the story, too controversial, too close to my personal situation, but a smaller publication, Oregon Independent Media, was interested. They didn't pay much, but they gave me the freedom to pursue the investigation wherever it led. I rented a cheaper apartment in southeast Portland, sold my car, and bought a used Honda Civic, and lived on ramen noodles and coffee while I chased leads across the state. It was the most financially precarious period of my life, but also the most focused. I had found my purpose. The first breakthrough came when I discovered that Richard's insurance company had received 2 previous complaints about his behavior. Complaints that had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements. The company had known about his pattern of harassment and had done nothing to stop it. Emma Rodriguez agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. She was smaller than I'd expected, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well despite her legal victory. "Thank you," she said simply when we sat down. "Your testimony made all the difference. How are you holding up?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been called every name in the book online. My boss suggested I might be happier working somewhere else. My boyfriend broke up with me because he said I was too much drama. But Richard Thornton is in prison, so I guess it was worth it. I'm working on a story about the company's handling of harassment complaints. Would you be willing to talk about your experience with their HR department? Emma's eyes lit up for the first time since I'd met her. You mean you're going after them too? I'm going after everyone who enabled this. Over the next 3 months, I interviewed 17 women who'd worked at various Oregon insurance companies. Their stories followed disturbingly similar patterns: harassment, complaints to HR, promises of investigation that led to nowhere, and eventually either resignation or termination for unrelated reasons. The story I ultimately published was called The Insurance Industry's Open Secret: How Oregon Companies Protect Predators and Silence Victims. It ran as a 3-part series in Oregon Independent Media and was immediately picked up by larger publications across the Pacific Northwest. The response was overwhelming. My inbox flooded with messages from women sharing their own stories, from lawyers offering to represent victims pro bono, from activists wanting to collaborate on reform efforts. For the first time since losing my job at the Tribune, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.
But the real validation came from an unexpected source. A week after the series was published, I received a Facebook message from someone named Jennifer Mullins. "I saw your article about Richard Thornton. I used to work with him at Pacific Northwest Insurance 5 years ago. We need to talk." Jennifer agreed to meet me at a restaurant in Beaverton. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of guarded expression that suggested she'd been carrying secrets for a long time. "Richard sexually harassed me for 8 months," she said without preamble. "I reported it to HR 3 times. Nothing happened, except that suddenly my performance reviews started getting worse. I eventually quit and signed an NDA to get my severance pay. Would you be willing to go on the record? After reading your story? After seeing that other women are finally being believed?" She nodded firmly. "Yes, I'm tired of being silent." As I drove home that night, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. The scared, isolated woman who'd walked out of that courtroom 6 months earlier was gone. In her place was someone harder, more focused, more determined to use her pain as fuel for change. I still missed my mother, I still grieved the loss of my family, but I'd found something else, a mission that mattered more than my own comfort, a purpose that justified every sacrifice I'd made. The girl who'd been afraid to speak up was becoming the woman who'd make sure other girls never had to face that fear alone. The cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Southeast Portland became my war room. I'd converted the dining area into an office space, with 3 monitors displaying spreadsheets of harassment complaints, timelines of corporate cover-ups, and a growing database of victims who'd contacted me after reading my insurance industry exposé. My daily routine was brutal but purposeful. I'd wake up at 5 a.m., spend 2 hours responding to emails from sources and victims, then grab coffee and a bagel before heading out to conduct interviews. Afternoons were for fact-checking and following paper trails through public records. Evenings were for writing, often until 2 a.m. when my eyes burned too much to continue. The financial reality was stark. Oregon Independent Media paid me $500 per published piece, and I was lucky to place 1 story every 3 weeks. I'd picked up some freelance copy editing work to cover rent, but it barely kept me afloat. I lived on generic cereal, peanut butter sandwiches, and the free coffee at the library where I did most of my research. But something remarkable was happening. What had started as one woman's quest for justice was becoming a movement. My inbox overflowed with messages from across the Pacific Northwest. Women sharing their stories, lawyers offering pro bono services, advocates wanting to collaborate. I realized I wasn't just reporting on the problem anymore, I was becoming the center of a network fighting it. 3 months after my insurance industry series ran, I got a call that changed everything. "Ms. Walsh, this is Detective Sarah Brennan with Portland PD's Special Victims Unit. The irony of sharing a last name with Richard's defense attorney wasn't lost on me. We've been following your reporting. Would you be available to meet this week?" Detective Brennan was in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen too much to be shocked by anything.
We met at a downtown diner where she slid a manila folder across the table. She said, "We've opened investigations into 3 of the companies you wrote about. Your reporting uncovered patterns we'd missed because victims were reporting to different precincts across the metro area." I opened the folder to find police reports, witness statements, and corporate emails obtained through search warrants. It was more evidence than I'd ever hoped to access as a freelance journalist. "Why are you sharing this with me?" "Because you understand this world in ways we don't. You know how these companies operate, how they move problem employees around, how they silence victims. We need someone who can connect the dots across corporate structures." "Are you asking me to consult for the police department?" "I'm asking if you'd be interested in a consulting contract. 20 hours a week, decent pay, full access to our investigation files. You'd help us build cases while continuing your journalism work." The offer was a lifeline I desperately needed, but more than that, it was validation. Law enforcement recognized that my work had value, that my perspective as both victim and journalist brought something unique to the fight against workplace predators. I accepted immediately. Working with the police department opened doors I never imagined. I had access to phone records, financial documents, internal corporate communications that revealed the calculated nature of these cover-ups. Companies weren't just failing to address harassment, they were actively protecting harassers because harassment lawsuits were cheaper than finding and training new employees.
My first joint investigation with Detective Brennan focused on Cascade Financial Services, where we'd identified a pattern of harassment complaints spanning 8 years. The company had quietly settled 12 cases with NDAs, moved 3 different managers between offices after complaints, and systematically retaliated against women who reported inappropriate behavior. The breakthrough came when I interviewed Monica Palmer, a former Cascade employee who'd received one of the largest settlement payments. She was hesitant to talk at first, bound by an NDA that threatened financial penalties if she spoke publicly. "I can't afford to pay back the settlement money," she said when we met at her home in Tigard. "I've got 2 kids and a mortgage." "What if we could prove the NDA was part of a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice?" I asked. "What if we could show that Cascade was systematically covering up crimes?" Monica's expression shifted from fear to something that looked like hope. "You really think you can take them down?" "I think we can try." Over the next 6 weeks, I worked 18-hour days building the Cascade case. I traced financial records showing how settlement payments came from a specific legal fund designed for reputation management. I interviewed 8 former employees who described a culture where harassment was an open secret and reporting it was career suicide. Most importantly, I found evidence that Cascade's HR director had destroyed complaint files after police inquiries. The story ran as a 5-part series called Cascade of Corruption: How One Company Built a System to Silence Sexual Harassment Victims. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the Portland Tribune, my former employer, called asking if I'd consider returning as their lead investigative reporter. The irony was delicious. The same publication that had forced me on leave for becoming part of the story now wanted me back because my personal experience had made me the most qualified person in Oregon to cover these issues. "The position comes with a 40% salary increase over your previous rate," Janet Morrison told me over lunch at our old haunt near the Tribune offices, "plus a research budget, travel allowance, and editorial independence for your harassment investigations." Editorial independence? You choose your own stories, set your own deadlines, publish what you think needs to be published. The only requirement is that everything meets our legal and factual standards. It was everything I'd ever wanted as a journalist, but accepting felt like betraying the scrappy independence I'd built. Oregon independent media believed in me when no one else would. Detective Brennan and I had developed an effective partnership. Did I really want to go back to the corporate media world that had abandoned me? "I need time to think about it," I said. That night, I called Maya Chen for advice. "Cass, this is incredible," she said after I explained the offer. "Do you realize what you've accomplished? You went from unemployed and estranged from your family to being the most sought-after investigative journalist in the Pacific Northwest. It doesn't feel like an accomplishment. It feels like survival. Maybe that's what real accomplishment looks like.
Maybe the difference between people who change things and people who don't isn't talent or luck, it's willingness to keep going when everything falls apart. I was mulling over the Tribune offer when I received an email that put everything in perspective. The sender was someone named Rebecca Martinez, a name I didn't recognize. Miss Walsh, you don't know me, but I was one of Richard Thornton's victims before he moved to Salem. I was 16 when he started coaching my softball team. I never reported what he did because I thought no one would believe me. But I wanted you to know that your courage in testifying gave me the strength to finally tell my parents what happened. It's been 5 years, and I'm finally in therapy. Thank you for showing me that speaking up doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. I read the email 3 times, tears streaming down my face. This was why none of the rest mattered. Not the job offers, not the media attention, not even my fractured relationship with my mother. Somewhere in Oregon, a young woman was finally healing because I'd found the courage to tell the truth. I accepted the Tribune position the next day, but with conditions. I'd continue my consulting work with Detective Brennan. I'd maintain my relationships with sources who trusted me as an independent journalist. And I'd dedicate at least half my reporting to cases that might not generate the kind of clicks and subscriptions that traditional media craved. Agreed, Janet said without hesitation. Cass, we're not just hiring you as a reporter. We're hiring you as a specialist. You understand this beat in ways that no one else does. My first day back at the Tribune felt like returning to a foreign country where I'd once lived. The office looked the same, but I was fundamentally different. I'd been tested in ways I never imagined, had lost everything I thought mattered, and had built something new from the wreckage.
My new desk came with business cards that read Cassandra Walsh, Senior Investigative Reporter, Sexual Harassment and Corporate Accountability. It was a mouthful of a title, but it represented something that had never existed before. A dedicated beat for holding institutions accountable for protecting predators. Within my first month back, I'd received tips about harassment cases in industries I'd never considered. Construction companies, tech startups, restaurant chains, even nonprofit organizations. The scope of the problem was staggering, but so was the network of people willing to fight it. Emma Rodriguez started volunteering with a victims advocacy group I'd connected her with. Monica Palmer became a source for other women considering whether to break their NDAs. Detective Brennan and I developed a system for sharing information that led to criminal charges in cases that might otherwise have remained civil matters. 6 months into my new position, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Workplace Safety in Chicago. Standing in front of 500 employment lawyers, HR professionals, and advocates, I realized how far I'd traveled from that scared young woman on the witness stand. The question isn't whether sexual harassment happens in your organization, I told the audience. The question is whether your organization has created systems that enable it to continue. Every time you prioritize reputation over accountability, every time you move a problem employee instead of firing them, every time you pay settlements that silence victims instead of exposing patterns, you become part of the problem. The standing ovation that followed felt like vindication, not just for me, but for every woman who'd been told she was overreacting, exaggerating, or seeking attention. We weren't crazy. We weren't vindictive. We were the canaries in the coal mine, warning about toxic systems that poisoned entire workplaces.
But the real validation came later that evening, when I checked my phone to find a text from a number I didn't recognize. Saw your speech online. I'm proud of the woman you've become. Aunt Linda. It wasn't my mother, but it was family. It was someone acknowledging that the choices I'd made, the sacrifices I'd endured, had transformed me into someone worth being proud of. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years after returning to the Portland Tribune, I stood in the newsroom holding a crystal award that read Investigative Reporter of the Year, Society of Professional Journalists, Pacific Northwest Region. The weight of it in my hands felt surreal,
not because I didn't deserve it, but because I could trace its origin directly back to the worst day of my life. My series, The Enablers, how Oregon's largest corporations systematically cover up sexual harassment, had won 3 major journalism awards and led to criminal charges against executives at 4 different companies. More importantly, it had resulted in policy changes that would protect thousands of workers across the state. "Speech!" called out Marcus Webb, one of my colleagues, raising his coffee mug in mock celebration.
I laughed, but the request wasn't entirely joking. Everyone in the newsroom knew my story, how I'd gone from unemployed and estranged from my family to becoming the most recognized voice on workplace harassment in the Pacific Northwest. They'd watched me transform from someone fleeing her past into someone weaponizing it for change. "I'll save the speeches for the acceptance dinner," I said, setting the award on my desk next to photos from my various investigations. Women who'd found their voices, executives who'd been held accountable, policies that had been changed. But the truth was, I was still processing how dramatically my life had shifted. My apartment in the Pearl District was twice the size of my old place, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. I drove a reliable Honda Accord instead of praying my old Civic would start each morning. I had a retirement account, health insurance that actually covered mental health therapy, and enough savings to take a vacation if I ever found time for one. More than the financial stability, though, was the professional respect. Lawyers called me for background on harassment cases. Other journalists sought my expertise on corporate accountability stories. Universities invited me to guest lecture on investigatory techniques. I'd become the person others turned to when they needed to understand how institutional power protected predators. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. "Ms. Walsh, this is Diana Foster from 60 Minutes. We're working on a segment about corporate responses to the #MeToo movement, and we'd love to interview you as our lead expert." 60 Minutes, the gold standard of investigative journalism, the show I'd grown up watching with my father before he died, the platform that every reporter dreamed of appearing on. 3 years ago, I'd been sleeping on a friend's couch and wondering if I'd ever work in journalism again. Now national television wanted my expertise. "I'd be honored," I managed to say. The interview was scheduled for the following week in Seattle. As I prepared, researching recent corporate scandals and crafting talking points about institutional accountability, I found myself thinking about the version of myself who'd sat in that law office watching my stepfather steal my sense of safety with forged documents and legal manipulation.
That woman had felt powerless, isolated, forced to choose between family loyalty and personal integrity. This woman, the one preparing for 60 Minutes, had turned that powerlessness into purpose, that isolation into independence, that impossible choice into a career built on protecting others from similar choices. The 60 Minutes segment aired on a Sunday evening in October. I watched it alone in my apartment, still not quite believing that the confident woman on screen discussing corporate liability and victim protection was actually me. My phone started buzzing before the segment even ended. Journalists wanting quotes, advocacy groups requesting partnerships, law firms seeking consultation. But the call that mattered most came from Detective Brennan. "Cass, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Check your email right now." The message she had forwarded was from an attorney in California representing 12 women suing a major tech company. Detective Brennan suggested I contact you directly. "We've been following your work in Oregon, and we believe we have a case that fits your expertise." The company has been systematically moving harassers between offices nationwide, using NDAs to silence victims, and maintaining what we can only describe as a predator protection program. Would you be interested in consulting on the largest corporate harassment case in tech industry history? I read the email twice, my heart pounding. This wasn't just another regional investigation. This was the kind of case that could set nationwide precedents,
that could force an entire industry to confront its culture of enabling abuse.
When do they need an answer? I asked Detective Brennan.
They want to fly you to San Francisco next week for a preliminary meeting. Cass, this could be huge. The company they're targeting has over 50,000 employees. If their allegations are true, we're talking about a systematic cover-up that could implicate dozens of executives. That night, I called Maya Chen to discuss the opportunity. "This is it," she said after I explained the California case. "This is your chance to go national, to take everything you've learned in Oregon and apply it on a scale that could change how every major corporation handles harassment." It's also terrifying. What if I'm not ready for something this big? Cass, you've spent 3 years becoming the leading expert on corporate harassment cover-ups. You've worked with police, lawyers, journalists, and advocacy groups. You've built a methodology for exposing these patterns that nobody else has. If you're not ready, then nobody is. The meeting in San Francisco took place in a glass conference room 40 floors above the city, with a view that reminded me how far I'd traveled from my cramped apartment in Southeast Portland. The legal team was impressive, partners from 3 different firms who'd coordinated their efforts to build what they described as an overwhelming case for systemic institutional failure. "Ms. Walsh," said the lead attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Liu, "we need someone who understands how these cover-ups work, who can trace the patterns across multiple offices and subsidiaries, who can explain to a jury how companies create cultures that protect predators." "What's the timeline?" 18 months to trial. We'd want you as our primary expert witness and consultant. You'd have access to all internal company documents, all victim statements, all the evidence we've gathered over 2 years of investigation. The retainer they offered was more money than I'd made in my entire freelance period. But more than the financial opportunity, this was a chance to take my work to the highest level, to influence not just regional policy, but national corporate behavior. "I need to discuss this with my editor at the Tribune. My journalism work is my primary obligation." "Actually," Catherine smiled, "we've already spoken with Janet Morrison. She's enthusiastic about the Tribune covering the case, with you as both consultant and lead reporter. She said, and I quote, 'Cassandra has earned the right to choose her own assignments.'" Flying back to Portland that evening, I stared out the airplane window at the lights below and tried to process how much my life had changed. 3 years ago, I'd been a local reporter whose biggest story was municipal corruption. Now I was being recruited for what could be the most significant corporate harassment case in history. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw you on 60 Minutes. Couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become. Sometimes the hardest truths lead to the most important work. JR." JR. I stared at the initials, trying to place them, when suddenly it clicked. Jennifer Rodriguez, Emma's older sister, who I'd met briefly during the original trial. She'd kept track of my career, had watched me turn her sister's courage into a movement for change. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and my laptop, drafting an email to Catherine Liu accepting the California consulting position. But before I hit send, I opened a new document and began writing what would become my most personal piece yet, an essay about how surviving betrayal had taught me to recognize institutional gaslighting, how losing my family had helped me build a chosen family of survivors and advocates, how the worst thing that ever happened to me had become the foundation for the most meaningful work of my life.
The essay would run in the Tribune the following week under the headline, "How My Stepfather's Crimes Taught Me to Fight Corporate Cover-Ups." It would be shared thousands of times, quoted in law school textbooks, and referenced in congressional hearings about workplace safety. But that night, it was just me and my laptop, finally ready to tell the complete story of how I'd transformed from victim to advocate, from isolated daughter to recognized expert, from someone who'd lost everything to someone who'd built something that mattered. The girl who'd been too scared to tell her mother about inappropriate behavior had become the woman companies feared most, because I'd learned to turn secrets into stories, silence into evidence, and personal pain into public accountability. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing deposition transcripts for the California Tech case. I didn't recognize the number, but something about the area code, 503, Salem, made my stomach tighten with familiar dread. Cassandra, this is your mother. 3 words. After 4 years of complete silence, those 3 words dropped into my carefully constructed life like stones into still water. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands, watching the liquid slosh dangerously close to the edge. Mom! My voice came out smaller than I'd intended, carrying echoes of the daughter I used to be before everything fell apart. I saw your essay in the Tribune, the one about Richard and your work. Her voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. We need to talk. Do we? The question came out harder than I meant it to, but 4 years of silence had a way of crystallizing into something sharp and defensive. Cassandra, please. I know I have no right to ask, but Richard is getting out of prison next month, and there are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Richard's release date? I'd known it was coming, had dreaded it from a distance, but hearing it from my mother's lips made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. What kind of things? Not over the phone. Would you be willing to meet me? I know Salem is a drive, but something I need to show you. Something I found after Richard was sentenced. Every instinct I'd developed over the past 4 years screamed at me to hang up, to maintain the boundaries I'd built, to protect the life I'd constructed from the wreckage of our family. But beneath the caution was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the stubborn hope that my mother might finally be ready to acknowledge the truth. I'll drive down this weekend, I heard myself saying. Thank you, she whispered, and I heard tears in her voice. Cass, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to understand what really happened. The drive to Salem felt like traveling backward through time. Every mile marker brought back memories I'd spent years trying to process. Family dinners, where Richard's comments made my skin crawl. Shopping trips with Mom, where I'd tried and failed to explain why I felt uncomfortable around her husband. Graduations and birthdays where I'd learned to perform normalcy while counting the minutes until I could escape. Mom was waiting for me at the front door of the house I'd grown up in. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair more gray than brown now, her face carrying lines that seemed etched by something deeper than age. When she hugged me, I felt how thin she'd become, how she seemed to fold in on herself like paper. You look good, she said, holding me at arm's length. Successful. I've been following your career, reading your articles. I'm proud of you. The words I'd waited years to hear felt hollow now, arriving too late and carrying too much baggage to offer real comfort. Come inside, she said. There's something I need to show you. The house looked exactly the same. Same floral wallpaper in the kitchen, same family photos on the mantel, same cream-colored carpet where Richard had once sat with his spreadsheets of manipulation. But something felt different, emptier, as if life had drained out of it. Mom led me to the kitchen table where a cardboard box sat like evidence waiting to be presented. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing stacks of papers, photographs, and what looked like electronic devices. I found these in Richard's home office after he was sentenced, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hidden in a safe I didn't even know existed. She pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me, with the careful reverence of someone handling toxic material. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens. Pictures of me at college, walking to class, studying in the library, having coffee with friends. Pictures from after I'd moved to Portland, standing outside my apartment building, getting into my car, sitting at outdoor cafe tables.
My blood turned to ice water. Mom, what is this? He was following you for years, even after you testified, even after he went to prison. He was having someone follow you and take pictures. Her voice broke. There's more. She pulled out a small recording device and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the kitchen, speaking to someone on the phone. The little bitch thinks she's so smart, building her career on my downfall. But I've got plans for when I get out. I know where she lives, where she works, what coffee shop she goes to every morning. She wants to destroy my life? I'll show her what real destruction looks like. The recording continued for several minutes, Richard detailing plans to sabotage my career, to spread rumors about my credibility, to contact my sources and clients with lies about my motivations. He'd been tracking my movement patterns, noting my routines, building a dossier for revenge. I stared at the photographs scattered across my mother's kitchen table, evidence of years of stalking, of a predator's obsession with the woman who dared to speak against him. My hands shook as I rifted through images of myself going about my daily life, completely unaware that I was being watched, catalogued, hunted. There's more, Mom said, pulling out a thick folder labeled Insurance Contacts. Inside were business cards, email addresses, and handwritten notes about bribes Richard had paid to keep his insurance license active while in prison. He'd been planning to resume his career the moment he was released, using connections who'd helped him maintain his professional credentials despite his conviction. Mom, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest, why are you showing me this now? She sat down across from me, her face crumbling into an expression of profound regret. Because I was wrong. About everything. About Richard, about you, about what happened in that courtroom. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. I chose to believe his lies because the truth was too terrible to face. I chose to protect a monster instead of my own daughter. You asked me to perjure myself. I know. The words came out as a sob. I know, and I've lived with that guilt every day for 4 years. I destroyed our relationship to protect a man who was planning to hurt you the moment he got out of prison. I looked at this woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who then asked me to choose wrong to protect her happiness. The anger I had carried for 4 years was still there, but it was joined now by something else. Pity, maybe, or recognition of how completely Richard had manipulated both of us. What do you want me to do with this? I asked, gesturing at the evidence spread across the table. I want you to use it. I want you to stop him from hurting anyone else. I want you to take everything I'm giving you and make sure Richard Thornton never has the power to destroy another person's life. I gathered the photographs, recordings, and documents into neat piles, my mind already shifting into investigative mode. This wasn't just evidence of stalking and harassment, it was proof of a systematic plan to obstruct justice, to retaliate against a victim, to continue patterns of abuse even from prison. I will need you to make a formal statement to the police. Everything you just told me you'll need to repeat under oath. I know. I'm ready. Mom, this could destroy whatever reputation Richard has left. It could extend his sentence, affect his parole status, expose everyone who helped him maintain his professional credentials. She met my eyes for the first time that afternoon, and I saw something there I hadn't seen in years. The mother who used to fight for me, who used to put my safety above her own comfort. Good, she said firmly. It's 4 years too late, but I'm finally going to protect my daughter the way I should have from the beginning. That evening, I called Detective Brennan from my hotel room in Salem. Sarah, I need you to meet me tomorrow morning. I have evidence of felony stalking, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. And I think it's going to crack this case wide open. Jesus, Cass, what did you find? Proof that some predators never stop hunting, but also proof that it's never too late for victims to become protectors. The next morning, my mother walked into the Salem Police Department and gave a 3-hour statement that would send Richard back to prison for another 5 years. She handed over every piece of evidence she'd found, answered every question the detectives asked, and waived any spousal privilege that might have protected her from prosecution. As we walked out of the police station together, she stopped and turned to me.
I know I can't undo the damage I caused. I know saying sorry doesn't give you back the 4 years we lost. But Cassandra, I want you to know that watching you become the woman you are today, seeing how you've used your pain to protect other people, it's the only thing that's given my life meaning since Richard was first arrested.
I looked at this fragile woman who'd finally found the courage to choose her daughter over her husband, justice over comfort, truth over the lies that had sustained her for years. "It's a start, Mom," I said. "It's a start." The GPS alert on my phone buzzed at exactly 8:23 a.m., just as I was stepping out of my car in the courthouse parking lot. "You've arrived at a frequently visited location." I almost laughed at the irony. The same courthouse where I'd once sat terrified in a witness box had become one of my most common destinations. But now I entered as an expert witness, consultant, and advocate, rather than a reluctant victim. Today marked the 5-year anniversary of my testimony against Richard, and I was here for something unprecedented: the sentencing hearing for a corporate executive whose company had systematically enabled workplace harassment across 14 states. The case had taken 3 years to build, involved testimony from 47 women, and represented the largest criminal prosecution of corporate harassment enablement in U.S. history. As I walked through the courthouse lobby, my phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, Washington, D.C. "Ms. Walsh, this is Senator Patricia Henley's office. The senator wanted to personally invite you to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee next month regarding the Corporate Accountability for Workplace Safety Act." I paused in the marble hallway, watching lawyers and defendants stream past me. 5 years ago, I'd been one of them. Nervous, isolated, uncertain about whether anyone would believe my truth. Now senators were calling me to help shape federal legislation. "I'd be honored," I replied. "Please send the details to my congressional liaison." Congressional liaison? The word still felt surreal. My one-person advocacy operation had grown into a nonprofit organization with 12 full-time staff members, offices in Portland and Sacramento, and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. The Cassandra Walsh Institute for Corporate Accountability, a name I initially resisted but eventually embraced, had become the leading authority on workplace harassment prevention and victim protection. Walking into the courtroom, I spotted familiar faces in the gallery. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, now serving as a federal prosecutor specializing in corporate crimes. Beside her was Dr. Lisa Park, who developed the therapeutic protocols we use to help harassment victims navigate the legal system. Detective Sarah Brennan had driven down from Portland specifically for this hearing, representing the law enforcement community that had adopted our investigation methodologies. But the presence that meant the most was in the third row, my mother, wearing the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for my congressional testimony 6 months earlier. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined, not the unquestioning loyalty she'd once demanded, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. As I took my seat at the expert witness table, I caught sight of the defendant, Marcus Webb, former CEO of Pacific Northwest Industries. Webb had spent 7 years systematically moving harassers between divisions, silencing victims with NDAs backed by criminal threats, and maintaining what prosecutors had termed a predator protection network that spanned multiple corporate subsidiaries. His attorney was Thomas Brennan, the same lawyer who'd represented Richard 5 years earlier. Seeing him again should have triggered anxiety, but instead I felt something like pity. Brennan had built his career defending the indefensible, and watching his clients receive increasingly severe sentences must have been wearing on his professional confidence. Judge Martinez called the court to order, and I was sworn in for what would be my 43rd appearance as an expert witness in harassment-related cases. The prosecutor, Elena Santos, approached with the kind of professional deference that still surprised me. "Ms. Walsh, you've reviewed the evidence in this case extensively. In your expert opinion, was Pacific Northwest Industries' handling of harassment complaints consistent with criminal conspiracy?" "Yes,"
I replied without hesitation. The evidence shows a systematic pattern of criminal activity designed to protect harassers and silence victims. This wasn't corporate negligence, it was criminal enterprise. For the next hour, I walked the court through the methodology I'd developed for identifying institutional patterns of predator protection. Phone records showing coordination between HR departments and legal teams, financial documents revealing slush funds specifically earmarked for victim silencing, email chains where executives discussed managing accusers through intimidation and retaliation. Your Honor, I conclude, this case represents the evolution of workplace harassment from individual misconduct to organized criminal activity. Companies like Pacific Northwest Industries have essentially become racketeering operations, using their resources and legal systems to enable repeated victimization. During cross-examination, Brennan tried the same tactics he'd used against me years earlier, questioning my objectivity, my motivations, my relationship with the victims. But this time, I wasn't a terrified young woman afraid of destroying her family. I was a nationally recognized expert with congressional endorsement and a track record of successful prosecutions.
Mr. Brennan, I said calmly, I understand you're doing your job, but let me be clear, my credibility isn't based on personal opinion. It's based on documented patterns across hundreds of cases, peer-reviewed research, and methodologies that have been validated by federal law enforcement agencies. Judge Martinez sentenced Webb to 12 years in federal prison and ordered Pacific Northwest Industries to pay $127 million in restitution to victims. More importantly, the ruling established legal precedent that would make similar prosecutions easier across the country. As the courtroom emptied, Emma Rodriguez approached me with tears in her eyes. Cass, do you realize what just happened? We've fundamentally changed how the legal system treats corporate harassment. 5 years ago, companies could enable predators with virtual impunity. Today, we sent a CEO to federal prison for it. Walking out of the courthouse, I found my mother waiting by my car. She'd started attending my major court appearances after we'd reconciled, not because I needed support, but because she wanted to witness the work I'd built from the ashes of our family's destruction. I'm proud of you, she said simply, not just for winning cases, but for becoming the kind of person who makes winning possible for other people. That afternoon, I drove to my office in Portland's Pearl District, a converted warehouse space with glass walls and collaborative work areas that housed the Institute's growing staff. My assistant, Jordan Kim, greeted me with a stack of congratulatory messages from advocacy groups across the country. Also, Jordan said, "You have a visitor. She's been waiting for about an hour." In my office sat a young woman, maybe 22, with the kind of nervous energy I recognized from my own early days of speaking up. She introduced herself as Ashley Morgan, a recent college graduate whose former professor had been stalking her through university-issued technology. Ms. Walsh, I've been following your work since I was in high school. When Dr. Richardson started tracking my location through my student ID, monitoring my computer usage, even accessing my dormitory keycard records, I knew what was happening because I'd read your articles about digital stalking. She pulled out a folder thick with documented evidence, screenshots, email logs, even GPS data she'd collected using techniques I'd outlined in my investigative guides. I wanted to thank you, but also to ask for your help. My university is trying to settle this quietly, but I think Dr. Richardson has done this to other students. I want to make sure he never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else. Looking at Ashley's determination, her methodical documentation, her refusal to be silenced, I saw something that filled me with profound satisfaction. The next generation of women who wouldn't accept victimization as inevitable, who understood that individual courage could become collective power. Ashley, I said, let me introduce you to Emma Rodriguez, our legal director. We're going to help you build a case that ensures Dr. Richardson faces both criminal and civil consequences. But more than that, we're going to use your experience to develop new protocols that protect students across the country.
That evening, I hosted the monthly dinner for my chosen family, the community of survivors, advocates, and allies who'd become the foundation of my personal life. My dining room table, now expanded to accommodate 12 people, was set with dishes from everyone's cultural backgrounds. Emma's grandmother's tamales, Detective Brennan's Irish soda bread, Dr. Park's Korean bulgogi, Maya Chen's mother's dumplings. During dinner, we shared updates from our various work. New policies implemented, survivors empowered, predators held accountable. But tonight felt different, more celebratory. The web sentencing represented a milestone none of us had imagined when we'd first met through crisis and trauma. "I want to propose a toast," said Maya, who'd driven down from Seattle, where she now ran the Northwestern Regional Office of the Corporate Accountability Legal Network. 5 years ago, most of us were isolated victims, afraid to speak up, uncertain whether anyone would believe us. Tonight, we're a movement that's changed federal law, influenced corporate policy across multiple industries, and inspired thousands of women to find their voices. "To transformation," I added, raising my glass. "To transformation," everyone echoed. After dinner, I found myself on my back porch with my mother, both of us wrapped in blankets against Portland's October chill. We'd developed this ritual over the past year. Quiet conversations where we processed our journey from betrayal to reconciliation. "Cassandra," she said, "I need to tell you something I've never said directly. Losing you was the worst consequence of my choices with Richard. But watching you rebuild your life, seeing the impact you've had on other families, it's taught me that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the most important thing you do. Mom, for a long time, I was angry that you chose protecting Richard over protecting me. But I've realized that your choice forced me to learn how to protect myself, and that skill has allowed me to protect thousands of other women. Do you really forgive me?"
I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness had been a process, not a moment. Layers of understanding built through therapy, time, and watching my mother actively work to repair the damage she'd caused. "I forgive the woman who was afraid to face the truth about her husband," I said finally. "And I respect the woman who eventually chose truth over comfort, accountability over convenience." Later that night, I sat in my home office, updating the digital map that tracked my institute's impact across the country. Red pins marked locations where our methodologies had led to successful prosecutions. Blue pins showed universities and corporations that had implemented our recommended policies. Green pins indicated survivor support networks that had been established using our training protocols. The map looked like a constellation of change, each point representing women who'd found their voices, institutions that had been held accountable, communities that had become safer. My phone buzzed with a notification. "Your location history shows you've spent 67% of your time this month at advocacy-related locations." The algorithm had learned to categorize my life not by personal preferences, but by professional purpose. I opened my laptop and began writing my weekly newsletter to the Institute's 847,000 subscribers, a mix of survivors, advocates, policymakers, and allies who joined our movement for corporate accountability. Tonight's subject line read, "The GPS of Justice, How Individual Courage Creates Collective Change." 5 years ago, I testified against my stepfather, not because I was brave, but because staying silent felt more dangerous than speaking up. That choice led me to discover something profound. When we refuse to be isolated by our trauma, when we transform our pain into purpose, we create navigation systems that help other people find their way to safety. I wrote about Ashley Morgan, about the 47 women whose courage had led to Marcus Webb's conviction, about the congressional testimony that was shaping federal legislation. But mostly, I wrote about the power of choosing truth over comfort, community over silence, accountability over enabling. The most sophisticated GPS technology can't guide you to a destination that doesn't exist yet. Sometimes you have to create the path yourself, step by step, choice by choice. Sometimes you have to be willing to get lost in order to help other people find their way home. As I hit send, distributing the newsletter to nearly 1 million people across 6 continents,
I thought about the girl who'd once been too frightened to tell her mother about inappropriate behavior. That girl had been afraid of disrupting the peace, of causing problems, of being responsible for other people's discomfort. This woman, the one whose work was referenced in federal legislation, whose methodologies were taught in law schools, whose story had inspired a movement, had learned that disrupting unjust peace was necessary for creating real safety, that causing problems for predators prevented problems for victims, that taking responsibility for speaking truth created space for other people to live authentically. My phone's GPS might navigate me between my office, the courthouse, and congressional hearing rooms, but the real navigation system of my life had led me somewhere I never could have planned, to a place where individual healing had become institutional change, where personal recovery had become public service, where one woman's refusal to be silenced had become a chorus of voices that changed the world. Looking out my office window at Portland skyline, I realized something that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. I was grateful. Grateful for the betrayal that had forced me to find my strength. Grateful for the isolation that had taught me to build real community. Grateful for the loss that had allowed me to discover what truly mattered. The GPS of my life had finally recalibrated completely. I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by exactly the people who deserved my trust. I was home.
Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.